A farmer was plowing his cornfield when he hit something metallic. Digging deeper, he realized there was a hidden airplane buried underground. The next day, men in suits arrived, and everything was gone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this from. The wind that moved through the plains of Nebraska that morning carried with it the smell of thawed soil and last year's corn husks breaking under the weight of the tractor. Spring had come late again, a gray and stubborn season, and the ground was still wet enough to cling to the tires and heavy ropes. John Mason leaned forward in his seat, squinting into the pale light. The tractor rattled in its steady rhythm, the only heartbeat left on the land. Beyond the rise of his field stretched the long horizon, a faded line where the color of the earth bled into the sky. The world here was vast and nearly silent, save for the machine's hum and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. He had been working this same patch of land for 20 years, first beside his father, later alone. The barn behind the house leaned slightly to the south, its red paint worn to the color of dust, and the farmhouse itself had a tired dignity, as if the years had settled over it like an old coat. There were mornings when John felt the same, part of the landscape, reliable and slowly eroding. His wife had died 5 winters ago, her laughter now just a sound he sometimes thought he heard in the walls when the wind was high. Their only son had left for Omaha soon after, chasing a kind of life that didn't smell of diesel and rain-soaked soil. He came back at Christmas sometimes, full of good intentions and polite hurry, and John always watched him drive away with an ache that was half pride and half envy. The farm was paid for, but barely profitable. Corn prices rose and fell with a cruelty that no one could predict, and each year seemed to bring a new reason for the government to send smaller checks. Still, the land was his, and that meant something. It had kept him upright when everything else around him had shifted. In the stillness of dawn, when the sky was a pale wash of light, he often stood on the porch with his coffee and told himself that this quiet, the long, endless quiet of the plains, was what he needed most. He did not always believe it, but the lie had softened into habit. That morning began like all the others. He checked the fuel, adjusted the plow, and started down the first row. The machine groaned against the wet ground, cutting deep, turning over layers of soil that hadn't seen light in months. It was honest work, the kind that left no room for thinking. The sky, the furrows, the smell of diesel. It all became a rhythm, a kind of conversation between man and earth. He was halfway through the southern stretch of the field when it happened. The plow jerked hard to the right, metal shrieking as if it had struck rock. John killed the engine and climbed down, boots sinking into the mud. He expected to find a stone or a buried fence post, maybe an old tool left behind by his father. But when he brushed away the wet soil with the edge of his glove, he saw something that stopped him. Beneath the surface was a glint of metal, smooth and pale, not the corroded brown of iron, but the silvery tone of something different, almost clean. He crouched and scraped at it more carefully. The patch widened. It was curved, the arc too precise to be random. He traced his fingers along it, feeling the cold through the glove. The metal was thick, seamless, like the skin of a machine. He tapped it with his knuckles, listening to the hollow echo that came back. A sound too deep for a barrel, too thin for a tank. He straightened slowly, staring at the earth around him. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. An old irrigation system, a storage container, maybe debris from a small aircraft that had crashed decades ago. But none of those seemed to fit. There were no records of wrecks here, no twisted trees, no scars in the soil. The field had always been just that, a field, quiet, predictable, unremarkable. He dug for another hour, curiosity outweighing reason. The shovel bit into the clay, bringing up clods of wet earth that released the smell of iron and roots. By noon, the shape beneath had begun to show itself, a smooth panel with a faint ridge running along its center, as if it belonged to something larger, something once designed to cut through air, not lie buried under it. When he tried to measure its length with the handle of his shovel, it vanished into the soil in both directions. John sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the uncovered patch. The clouds moved low across the sky, and for a moment he imagined the earth as a body, the field its skin, and what he had struck. A rib, a bone, a fragment of something the world had chosen to forget. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and unease, the same feeling he used to get when fixing an electrical circuit and realizing that one wrong wire could burn down a house. By late afternoon, he covered the hole again. The day was fading, and his hands ached. As he drove the tractor back to the barn, the thought of what lay beneath followed him like a shadow. He told himself he would check it properly tomorrow, maybe with better tools. For now, he needed rest. But that night, lying in bed, the sound replayed in his mind. The sharp metallic clang, the echo that seemed to go on too long. He closed his eyes and saw it again. That glint of metal, that curve of light in the mud. Sleep came in fragments. At one point, he dreamed he was standing in the field under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow him. The ground beneath his feet was breathing, lifting and falling, as though something enormous turned slowly in the soil. When he woke, the room was dark and still. The only sound was the old house settling on its frame. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples, and realized he was smiling, not out of joy, but because he hadn't felt this kind of pulse in years. Something had been unearthed, not just in the ground but in him. The next morning dawned cold and colorless. A layer of mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the world. John stood on the porch with his coffee, staring toward the southern stretch of land where the plow had struck. From here, the earth looked undisturbed, innocent, as if it had already forgotten yesterday. He knew better. The ground remembered everything. He had always believed the land kept its stories, even if people didn't. He'd found traces before: a rusted horseshoe, a piece of wagon wheel, an old glass bottle with air bubbles trapped in its walls. Each fragment was a reminder that others had walked here, worked here, bled and left behind small proofs of their existence. But this was different. This wasn't a relic. It was a secret, and secrets didn't hide in the soil by accident. He thought briefly about telling someone, maybe his neighbor Sam Harper, who'd flown crop dusters in the 70s and still talked about airplanes as if they were living creatures. Sam would know what to make of it, yet even as the idea formed, John hesitated. Something about the discovery felt private, as though speaking of it too soon might break whatever fragile truth it carried. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and looked out over the expanse of his land. The field stretched endlessly, rows of soil like lines in an open book waiting to be read. The sun began to rise, turning the mist to gold. He told himself that after chores, after feeding the cattle and checking the fence line, he would return with a shovel, not to chase answers, just to see. But beneath that simple thought was another, quieter one. It whispered to him as the light spread across the horizon. Some things are meant to stay buried. He pushed it aside. Men like him didn't have time for superstition. The world was built on the things they dug up. By midday, when the clouds thickened and the wind picked up, the soil where he'd struck the metal was already calling to him. He could feel it, a kind of pull, faint but insistent, like gravity remembering a stone. He paused by the barn, glanced once toward the field, and smiled without meaning to. It was the smile of a man who didn't yet know that curiosity has a price, that the earth never gives without taking something in return. The land around him lay quiet, the same quiet he had once mistaken for peace. In truth, it was only patience, the patience of ground that keeps its own history beneath the roots. That evening, as dusk bled into night, John stood on the porch again. The tractor sat in silhouette against the dim sky. Beyond it, the field shimmered faintly under the half-light, as though the soil itself held a memory of metal. He listened to the wind sweeping through the empty rows, and thought he heard the faintest echo of that hollow sound again, distant but clear, like the ring of something waiting to be remembered. And for the first time in years, he felt awake. He didn't know that the simple act of turning the earth had opened more than just a field. Somewhere beneath those acres of quiet clay, something man-made and deliberate waited. Tomorrow he would dig deeper. He told himself it was just curiosity, but the truth was simpler and far older. Every farmer knows that the earth gives back what it owes eventually. It remembers. It waits. When he finally went inside and turned off the porch light, The darkness folded around the farmhouse, deep and complete. In that darkness, the land settled. The wind died down, and beneath the sleeping field, metal rested against earth, silent, intact, and patient, as though it knew the time for silence was nearly over. The morning after the discovery came gray and heavy, the kind of day that seemed to press the horizon closer. A fine mist clung to the air, and the soil beneath John Mason's boots gave softly as he crossed the yard toward the southern field. He carried his old shovel on his shoulder, the same one his father had used decades ago to dig fence posts and trenches for irrigation lines. Its handle was worn smooth by years of work, the metal blade dulled but still steady. He had slept little. The image of that silver curve beneath the earth had stayed in his mind through the night, gleaming behind his closed eyes, calling him back. From the porch, the field had looked as innocent as ever. Rows of damp soil, patches of fog curling low between the furrows. But now, as he stepped onto it, John noticed the difference. The air smelled faintly metallic, a note beneath the scent of wet clay. The tractor tracks from yesterday's plowing were half erased by the drizzle, but the spot where the blade had struck was easy to find. The soil there was darker, the ground slightly sunken. He began to dig. The sound of the shovel cutting into the earth was steady, rhythmic. Each thrust brought up clumps of dirt and roots, small stones, bits of rusted wire. He worked with slow precision, setting each pile aside. The first few feet revealed nothing unusual, only compacted clay streaked with moisture. Then the metal reappeared, smooth, cold, indifferent. He knelt, brushed it clean with his gloved hand, and felt again that strange curvature, the sense of shape hidden beneath. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no simple object. The line of the metal continued in both directions, vanishing into the earth like a buried vein. A shadow fell across the hole, and John turned. Sam Harper stood behind him, hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, a wool cap pulled low on his head. He was in his 60s, lean and wiry, his skin tanned to the color of old leather. "Morning," Sam said, his voice carrying the easy drawl of the plains. "You're at it early." "Couldn't sleep," John replied, and went back to work. Sam crouched beside the pit, squinting. "You hit rock?" "Metal." Sam's brow furrowed. "Scrap?" John brushed more dirt away. "Doesn't look like it." The older man studied the curve of the exposed surface, then tapped it lightly with the toe of his boot. A hollow echo answered, deep and resonant. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam murmured. "That's not farming equipment." He knelt, tracing the outline with a finger. "See that curve? That's aviation metal, aluminum alloy. Strong, light. We used stuff like that on planes back in the day." John looked up at him, startled. "A plane? Out here?" Sam shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first crash in Nebraska, but there should have been wreckage. A report, something." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "How deep does it go?" "Don't know yet." Sam nodded slowly. "You mind if I stick around?" Together they dug for hours, trading silence for the rhythm of work. The ground was dense, resistant. Rain had softened the top layer, but beneath it the clay was heavy and stubborn. By noon they had exposed a wider section of the metal surface, a panel nearly 6 feet across, pocked with rivets that glinted faintly in the dim light. Near the edge of the pit, a thin seam ran along the metal's curve. Sam brushed at it with the care of a man handling something fragile. When the dirt cleared, they saw what looked unmistakably like the outline of a window. "Jesus," Sam whispered. "That's an aircraft fuselage. Look, the frame, the glass mountings. This is the side of a plane." John felt a cold ripple pass through him. He stepped back, trying to take in the size of it. The metal stretched far beyond what they'd uncovered. It wasn't a small craft, not a crop duster or a private two-seater. Whatever this was, it was enormous. Sam stood, brushing the mud from his hands. "I flew for 20 years, he said quietly. "Never heard of anything this big going down near here. No crash sites, no memorials. And look at it. There's no burn, no shatter marks. It's clean." John frowned. Could have been buried later. Why would anyone bury a plane? The question hung between them, unanswered. The wind moved across the open field, bending the dry stalks at the edges, and somewhere a crow called once, sharp and distant. They stopped for a while to rest. John sat on the edge of the pit, breathing hard. His gloves were slick with mud, his shirt clinging to his back. Sam lit a cigarette, the smoke curling pale against the gray sky. "You gonna tell someone?" he asked. "Maybe. County office would want to know. Hell, the FAA too." John nodded, but his thoughts were far away. He imagined the field as it must have looked before his family owned it. Open land, maybe pasture, maybe prairie. If this thing had been here all along, how many times had his father plowed over it, planting seed above a secret too deep to disturb? The idea unsettled him. When Sam left, promising to come back the next day with better tools, John remained. The sky had cleared a little, streaks of pale blue cutting through the clouds. He kept digging, slower now, working along the edges, exposing more of the surface. The further he went, the more certain he became. This wasn't wreckage. It was intact, buried deliberately, preserved. He found a fragment of paint, faded crimson, the color still vivid where the dirt had protected it. Beneath it, the faint trace of a letter, curved and looping, part of a logo perhaps. He tried to brush away more, but the soil clung tightly, refusing to yield. That evening, as he drove back to the house, the field behind him glowed faintly with the dying light. He felt both exhilarated and uneasy. The discovery had become something larger than curiosity. It was a question that refused to leave his mind. What kind of plane was it? Who had put it there? And why? After supper, he sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, searching through old aviation records. There were databases of crashes, archived newspaper clippings, lists of lost flights dating back decades. Nothing matched. No reports of missing airliners, no unexplained disappearances in his county. It was as if the sky itself had forgotten. He leaned back, staring at the screen. The farmhouse around him creaked in the cooling air, the pipes ticking softly behind the walls. The silence of the plains was deep and layered. Sometimes it sounded like peace, sometimes like warning. By morning he had made his decision. He would report it, at least to the county office. Whatever was buried out there wasn't his to keep. But even as he told himself that, a part of him hesitated. The thought of strangers trampling his land, of machines and noise tearing through the quiet, filled him with unease. He called the county office at 8. The receptionist listened patiently as he described the find, her voice distant through the crackle of the line. "Could be an old tank," she said finally. "We've had folks dig those up before. You want, we can send someone from Public Works to take a look." "That'd be fine," he said, though the certainty in her tone bothered him. When the county truck arrived 2 days later, the man who stepped out looked skeptical before he even saw the pit. He was young, wearing clean boots and a reflective vest, clipboard tucked under his arm. He crouched beside the exposed section of metal, knocked on it once, and frowned. "Too light for a tank," he said. "Too big for a car. You sure this isn't just scrap?" John said nothing. "Well, we'll note it." "I'll tell my supervisor," the man continued, scribbling something on the form. "But this is private property. You're fine to keep digging if you want. Just don't hit any gas lines." After the truck drove off, John stood for a long time staring at the empty road. He knew what he'd seen. He wasn't imagining it. And if the county didn't care, he would find out himself. That afternoon, Sam returned with a set of small excavation tools and an old manual pump he used for draining basements. They widened the hole carefully, removing the wet soil bit by bit. As the sun dropped lower, the metal stretched out beneath them, revealing faint rows of rivets and the outline of what looked like another window. The structure was unmistakable now. Sam wiped his forehead with a sleeve. "John, I think this was buried on purpose." John looked up. "By who?" "Hell if I know. But it's not crushed. No debris, no fuel burn. The ground around it's too clean. Somebody put it here piece by piece, or found a way to sink the whole damn thing intact." The thought seemed impossible, but the evidence was in front of them. The aircraft was whole, silent, preserved in its cocoon of earth. John imagined the years layering over it, rain, roots, the rhythm of seasons, until it became part of the landscape itself. By dusk, they had uncovered what appeared to be the curve of the nose section. Sam ran his hand along it, marveling softly. Mid-century design, maybe. 50s, I'd guess. Look at the lines. This thing was built for speed. John didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a small emblem near the edge of the exposed metal. A silver outline of wings, corroded but still visible. Beneath it, faded letters spelled something he couldn't yet make out. He traced them gently, dirt smearing beneath his fingertips. That night he dreamed again of the field, but this time he was beneath it, walking through rows of metal ribs and empty seats, his footsteps echoing in a corridor that seemed endless. The air smelled of oil and dust. Somewhere far above, he could hear the wind, muted by layers of earth. When he woke, his heart was pounding. He rose before dawn and went to the window. The world outside was wrapped in fog. The field was invisible beyond the fence, but he could sense it there. The weight of it, the secret pressing upward. He felt both the pull of discovery and the dread of what it might mean. In the coming days, others would arrive. Officials, journalists, strangers. The quiet he had built his life around would be gone. But standing there in the dim light, John didn't know that yet. He only knew that the earth had opened a small window, and he had looked inside. When the sun finally rose, turning the fog to pale gold, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and still. The rows of soil stretched toward the horizon, hiding what lay beneath. Somewhere under those acres, a machine built for the sky was sleeping, waiting for someone to uncover the rest of its story. And John Mason, who had spent half his life tending what grew above the ground, knew he would keep digging until he learned what the earth was trying to tell him. By the end of that week, the quiet rhythm of John Mason's farm had been broken. The road that once saw only delivery trucks and the occasional neighbor's pickup now carried government vehicles, their tires crushing the gravel in slow, deliberate turns as they arrived one after another. What had begun as a private curiosity in the soil had turned into an official discovery, and the field that had fed his family for generations became something else entirely, a site, a perimeter, a restricted zone. They came first in khaki uniforms from the county transportation office, carrying clipboards and the uneasy politeness of men performing a task they didn't fully understand. Then came others, 2 from the state, 1 from the Federal Aviation Administration, another in a plain gray sedan who showed no badge and spoke in short, clipped phrases. The last group, arriving in black SUVs, wore no insignia at all. They carried themselves with quiet authority, moving through the field as though they already owned it. John stood near the fence line, hat pulled low, watching them work. The early morning sun caught the glint of metal as they widened the hole he and Sam had started. Excavators arrived, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, the sound echoing across the flat landscape. He felt the vibration in his boots as the machines began tearing into the earth that had been his livelihood, his memory, his refuge. When he tried to step closer, a man in a reflective vest raised a hand. "Sir, we'll have to ask you to stay behind the line," he said with practiced calm. "That's my field," John replied. "Yes, sir, and we appreciate your cooperation. This is just for your safety. We'll let you know as soon as we can." They did not let him know. They worked in silence, voices carried only in brief exchanges over radios. Sam arrived mid-morning, his pickup pulling in beside John's. Together they watched as a section of the fuselage was lifted from the soil by a crane, sunlight flashing along its polished surface. It was enormous, its nose rounded and intact, its windows black with packed earth behind the glass. There were no visible marks of fire or impact. "That's not a crash," Sam murmured. "That thing's been sleeping down there." John nodded, unable to answer. The sight was both magnificent and wrong, a shape meant for the open sky trapped in the belly of the earth. It seemed almost obscene, like a buried cathedral. By noon, the local news had arrived. A van with a satellite dish parked beside the road. A reporter in a red coat standing before a camera, her voice bright with the thrill of discovery. "Behind me," she said, "archaeologists and federal officials are investigating what appears to be a mid-century passenger aircraft, found entirely intact beneath a cornfield in rural Nebraska. The origin of the plane remains unknown, though experts describe the find as unprecedented, The broadcast ended abruptly when one of the men in suits approached the crew. Minutes later, the van drove away, its dish folded down like a clipped wing. That night, under the pale floodlights strung across the site, the work continued. The field no longer smelled of soil and rain, but of oil and ozone, of machines that did not belong. John stood at his fence long after dark, the glow of the lights flickering across his weathered face. He could see figures moving, hear the thud of boots, the hum of generators. He didn't recognize his land anymore. The next morning, an official car pulled into his driveway. A woman stepped out, neat, efficient, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself as someone from the Department of Transportation and handed him a folder. Inside were forms stamped, temporary restriction order, and a compensation notice. "This is just standard procedure, Mr. Mason," she said smoothly. "Until the investigation concludes, we need to maintain control of the site. You'll be compensated for any loss of crop or revenue." John looked at the papers, then at her. "For how long?" "As long as necessary." "And what exactly are you investigating?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss that." He wanted to argue, but the calm in her tone drained the will from him. He signed where she indicated, the pen trembling slightly in his calloused fingers. When she drove away, the dust from her tires lingered in the air like smoke. Over the following days, the site grew. Temporary fencing went up, security lights, portable offices. Trucks came and went at all hours. Sam tried to get close once and was politely escorted away. "You'd think they found gold under there," he said later, shaking his head. One afternoon, as John returned from town, he found two men waiting by his porch. They wore dark suits and carried briefcases, the kind of men whose presence changed the air around them. "Mr. Mason," one said, offering a thin smile, "we appreciate your cooperation. I'm Agent Harlan. My colleague is Agent Price." They asked questions: how he had found the plane, how deep it was buried, whether he had removed anything from the site. He answered simply, truthfully. When he mentioned that there had been no wreckage, no bodies, the agents exchanged a glance. "Did you notice any markings?" Harlan asked. "Some letters, maybe part of a name. Air, or something like it." "Did you take a photograph?" "No." "Good," Price said quietly and closed his notebook. "We'd prefer you not to should you come across anything else." When they left, John felt an odd hollowness, as though his own memories had been confiscated. The conversation had not been threatening, but it carried a weight he could not shake. By the end of the week, the reporters stopped coming. The story disappeared from the local paper, replaced by grain prices and high school sports. When John searched online, the earlier articles were gone, their links leading only to blank pages. Even Sam, usually talkative, seemed wary of discussing it. "They told me it's classified now," he said one evening. "Whatever that means." Classified. The word sat like a stone in John's stomach. What could a buried plane possibly have to do with national secrets? Each night the field glowed with artificial light. He would stand by the window, watching the silhouettes move against the glare, the cranes lifting sections of metal into trucks covered with tarps. There was no sound but the steady thrum of engines. By dawn, the machines were gone, leaving only the churned mud and the faint tracks of heavy tires. On the fourth morning, he woke to silence. The fences had been removed, the lights taken down. The field stretched before him as it always had, bare and endless. Only the ground looked different, too level, too smooth, as if freshly pressed. He walked out, boots sinking slightly in the softened soil. There was no trace of the pit, no sign that anything had ever been there. He knelt, picked up a handful of dirt, let it fall through his fingers. The earth was cold and damp, unmarked. Sam came by that afternoon. "They packed up fast," he said, scanning the horizon. "Guess they found what they wanted." "Did they?" John asked quietly. His friend shrugged. "Don't know. Maybe they didn't want to." In town, people spoke less and less about the discovery. At the diner, conversation turned awkward when John entered. A few men nodded politely but avoided his eyes. He could feel the shift, the unspoken discomfort of those who preferred the world to remain ordinary. He had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, and that made him a disturbance. Weeks later, an official envelope arrived in the mail. It contained a final notice from the Department of Transportation, confirming that the investigation had concluded with no significant findings. Enclosed was a check, a sum too generous to refuse and too small to justify what he had lost. He placed it in a drawer and never cashed it. At night he sometimes dreamed of the field, the silver curve beneath the soil, the sound of the crane lifting it into the light. But the dreams always ended the same way, with the ground closing again, smooth and quiet, as though swallowing not just the plain, but the memory of it. Spring turned to summer. The grass grew thick where the excavators had stood. Life on the farm resumed its slow, measured pace, yet something inside him had shifted. The land no longer felt like a place he understood. He would drive his tractor across the fields and imagine the hollow spaces below, the ghosts of machines, the weight of buried history pressing upward. One evening, standing by the fence at sunset, John noticed a shimmer on the horizon, a reflection, brief but sharp, as if sunlight had caught on something metallic beneath the rows of soil. It vanished before he could be sure. He stood there long after the light faded, the wind rustling through the corn. He did not go closer. He knew somehow that the digging was over, that whatever truth had been hidden beneath his land had already been taken away, locked behind the silence of official language and closed files. The earth had reclaimed its secret, and the men in suits had erased the rest. But sometimes when the nights were still and the wind moved in slow waves through the stalks, he could swear he heard the faint echo of engines deep below, an old sound, buried but not gone, reminding him that some things, once uncovered, never truly returned to sleep. When the machines left and the men in suits disappeared beyond the long line of the horizon, the world around John Mason returned to a strange quiet, the kind that didn't feel like peace anymore. The days passed, but the silence of his land had changed. It no longer rested, it waited. The field was smooth again, the soil pressed down by heavy tires and shovels, but the memory of the work lingered in the air. Each morning, when the light spread over the rows of turned earth, John could still see the marks where the trucks had stood, the faint indentations of boots that the rain hadn't yet washed away. The authorities had said the case was closed, but his instincts told him nothing was finished. Something about the way they had left swiftly, without word, without trace, felt wrong, like a door slammed shut before anyone could look inside. He started asking questions. At first they were simple ones, curious, harmless. He called the county office, the transportation department, even the local paper. Every time the answers came back short and distant. There was no official record of the discovery, no photographs, no coordinates, no confirmation that anything had ever been found beneath his field. The reporter who had come that first day never returned his calls. One of the clerks at the county office told him that the excavation had been listed as routine soil analysis. When he asked for documentation, she paused for a long moment before saying, "I don't think I can help you, sir," and hung up. For the first time in years, John drove into town not to buy feed or fuel, but to dig through archives. The library smelled of dust and aging paper, the air humming with the soft whir of fluorescent lights. He found a corner table and began scrolling through reels of microfilm, searching for anything, an old news clipping, a mention of a crash, an unexplained disappearance. He went back as far as the 1940s. There were floods, harvests, fairs, weddings, even a piece about a calf born with two heads, but no mention of an airplane. The silence of the record was as complete as the silence of the field. That night, when he told Sam about it, his friend looked troubled. "You're not going to like this," he said, sipping his coffee slowly. "But I remember hearing something, way back when I was a kid. My uncle flew out of a small private strip west of Omaha. He used to talk about a company, some kind of private charter operation, not military, but connected, you know. Businessmen, politicians, folks who didn't want their names on manifests. They ran flights under a company called Central Midwest Air." He paused, watching the steam rise from his mug. "Sometime in the early 60s, one of their planes went missing. Big one, twin-engine passenger job. But there was never a report, no search, nothing. They said it was a paperwork error, but everybody in aviation knew something had gone wrong." John frowned. "And you think that's what we found?" "I think somebody didn't want that plane found at all." He didn't answer. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. "If that's true," he said finally, "why bury it out here?" Sam shrugged. Maybe they needed somewhere no one would look. Flat land, quiet, private. And you, my friend, have about the quietest land in the county. After Sam left, John sat alone at the table, the house around him creaking softly in the wind. The old clock above the door ticked with a slow, steady pulse, counting something he couldn't name. He thought about the men in suits, about their calm expressions and empty promises. They hadn't come to study the plane. They'd come to remove it. The next morning before sunrise, he drove out to the field. The air was still cold, a pale frost clinging to the edges of the stalks that had begun to grow back in the disturbed soil. He stood in the middle of it all and tried to picture what lay beneath the length of the fuselage, the rows of windows now sealed again in darkness. The thought made him dizzy. That evening, he saw lights on the road. A convoy of trucks rolled past his property, unmarked but familiar. They didn't stop, didn't slow down. But when he went out the next morning, the field looked different again. A new patch of soil had been disturbed near the western edge, and the grass there was flattened. He walked over, heart pounding, but whatever had been done was finished. Only the smell of gasoline lingered in the air. A few days later, a letter arrived. No return address, only his name typed neatly in black ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message brief and unnerving. "You found something that doesn't belong to you. Let it rest." The words were not a threat. They were an instruction, cold and absolute. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer beside the check he had never cashed, and closed it. For the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the house. The dogs barked at nothing. The phone rang once and stopped. That night, a truck idled for a few minutes on the road before driving off. When he told Sam, the older man exhaled slowly. "John, this is bigger than us. You can't fight ghosts with dirt and questions." "I just want the truth," John said. Maybe the truth's already been buried with it. But John wasn't ready to let go. He drove north to a small aviation museum near Lincoln, where old pilots kept records that no one else cared about. There he met a retired mechanic named Reynolds who had once worked for Central Midwest Air. When John mentioned the logo he'd seen, the faint winged emblem on the fuselage, the man grew quiet. "That's not a company you want to be asking about," Reynolds said finally. "They weren't just flying passengers. They were moving things, money, people, sometimes information. The kind of cargo that disappears when someone says so." "Did one of their planes go missing?" John asked. Reynolds hesitated. "You didn't hear this from me, but yeah, 1962, flight out of Kansas City headed for Denver. No distress call, no debris. Some said it was stolen. Others said it landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Officially, it never existed." He looked at John with a weary half-smile. "That's the trick about records. Erase them long enough and people start believing nothing ever happened." Driving home, John watched the horizon darken. The highway stretched straight and endless. And for the first time, he noticed how empty the sky looked. He thought of that buried machine under his field, sealed away not by accident, but by choice. A few nights later, he saw movement again. 2 figures by the fence line, silhouettes against the stars. When he stepped outside with his flashlight, they were gone, but fresh tire tracks curved through the grass. He followed them with his beam until they disappeared at the edge of the field. The soil there was still soft, darker than the rest. Something heavy had been dragged. By dawn, the tracks were gone. The wind had swept them smooth, as if the land itself was cooperating with whoever came in the night. After that, John stopped calling the authorities. He stopped asking questions aloud. The silence had grown too thick, too controlled. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an enforced quiet, the kind that followed a command. But he couldn't stop thinking. Each day as he worked, he imagined the plane's interior, the rows of empty seats, the instruments frozen in darkness, the dust lying thick over forgotten controls. He wondered who had been inside it, what they had been carrying, and why the world had chosen to erase them. One afternoon, while cleaning out the barn, he found an old camera, his wife's, a film model she used to take pictures of harvest festivals. The thought came unbidden. If they tried to hide everything, maybe he could preserve something, even if only for himself. That evening, when the light was low, he walked to the center of the field and took 3 photographs. Nothing dramatic, just the smooth soil, the horizon, the quiet space where the secret slept. A week later, the photos disappeared from his kitchen table. He searched the house, convinced he'd misplaced them, but they were gone. Only the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air, a brand he didn't smoke. That night, the electricity flickered twice and then returned. The wind was sharp and dry, rattling the windows. He sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the field beyond the glass, trying to decide whether the line between memory and imagination had already been crossed. He began to understand that the story he'd stumbled into wasn't just about a buried plane. It was about erasure, the deliberate kind, the kind that left no trace of what had been real. The world had no shortage of forgotten things, but this was different. This wasn't forgotten, it had been made to vanish. In the weeks that followed, he spoke less, slept little, and found himself glancing at the sky with a new unease. Even the passing of ordinary planes overhead filled him with a strange sorrow. They moved freely where another had been condemned to darkness. One evening, as he sat by the window, the sunset burning orange over the horizon, Sam's truck pulled into the yard. The older man climbed out, his expression grim. "They came to see me too," he said quietly. "Asked about what we found. I told them nothing." John looked past him, toward the field. "They'll come again." "Then let them," Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We didn't do anything wrong." "Finding something you're not supposed to find," John said softly, "might be the worst crime there is." The 2 men stood together in silence as the light faded. The land stretched around them, vast and empty, the same as it had always been. Yet both could feel it, the pulse beneath the ground, the unspoken truth that still breathed under the soil. By the time night fell, the wind had quieted, and the stars came out in sharp, cold clarity. From the edge of the field, the earth looked smooth again, untouched. But in the heart of that silence, John knew the truth had only been buried deeper. And somewhere beyond the reach of any record, a story continued to exist that no one was willing to tell. Autumn came early that year, creeping across the plains with a dry wind that carried the scent of harvested fields and distant rain. The corn had grown unevenly where the excavation had torn through the soil. Some stalks reached high and green, others wilted and brittle, as if the earth beneath them had forgotten how to give. The field looked ordinary from the road, but John Mason could see the difference. He could feel it in the way the tractor jolted when it crossed the filled-in pit, the way the soil there settled more quickly than anywhere else, as if breathing beneath its own weight. It was a wound trying to close. Life on the farm had slowed to a crawl. The crops brought in less than before, and the bank sent polite reminders that his payments were overdue. John read them without reaction, the same way he read the local newspaper that now seemed determined to fill its pages with everything except what mattered. The buried plane, the men in suits, the trucks that came in the night, none of it had happened, at least not in the world beyond his fence line. Even Sam, once so restless and curious, had gone quiet. When they met, their conversations turned to the weather, machinery, small things that wouldn't bring trouble. It was safer that way. One morning, as John stepped out onto the porch, he found an envelope on the ground by the steps. No address, no postage. He turned it over in his hands, heart already heavy with recognition. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on a mechanical typewriter. The words uneven but deliberate. "You found what was not meant to be found. Let the ground keep what's buried, or it will take more." He stared at the message for a long time before folding it neatly and tucking it inside the drawer with the other letter. The 2 pieces of paper lay together, quiet and thin as the ghosts of something half erased. He told no one about it. There was no point. The authorities wouldn't help. They were part of it, or at least aware enough to pretend ignorance. The neighbors already thought him strange. A few had stopped waving from their trucks when they passed. Once in the hardware store, he heard someone say his name followed by a whisper. "The man who dug up the sky." He pretended not to hear. Days became identical. He worked the land because it was the only thing left to do. He patched fences, oiled the tractor, fed the cattle, and tried not to look too long at the flat, level space in the middle of the field. The silence of that place was no longer peaceful. It was thick, like a held breath. When he stood there, he sometimes felt a vibration through his boots, a faint rhythmic tremor, too soft to be the wind, too steady to be imagination. At night, sleep refused to come easily. He would lie awake listening to the sounds of the house, the shifting timbers, the low groan of old pipes, the whisper of wind against the windows. Every creak made him think of the men who had stood on his porch, the way they had looked at him with polite finality. They hadn't threatened him, not directly, but their silence had been a warning sharper than any words. One evening, he sat by the radio, tuning through the static, hoping for distraction. A local station played old country songs, the kind his wife used to hum while cooking. He turned up the volume, let the music fill the empty rooms. For a while, he almost felt normal. But when the song ended, the static returned, he thought he heard something behind it, a voice, faint and distorted, repeating a sequence of numbers. It was probably just interference, some far-off broadcast carried by the wind. Still, he turned off the radio and sat in the dark, listening. The silence pressed in around him. A week later, he drove into town to settle a few small debts. At the post office, the clerk gave him a wary smile. "You've got something here," she said, handing him a brown envelope. The sender's line was blank. Inside was a check from the Department of Transportation, another payment. Larger this time, with a note reading simply, "Final compensation." He folded it once, slid it into his coat pocket, and walked out without a word. As he drove home, the sky began to darken. A storm was coming, the kind that rolled across the plains like a moving wall. By the time he reached the farmhouse, the first drops had begun to fall. The rain came hard, drumming against the tin roof, turning the field into a blur of shifting gray. He stood at the window watching it, remembering the night the excavation lights had burned through the same darkness, remembering how the rain had hissed against the metal of the buried plain. The sound now was almost identical. When morning came, the world smelled of mud and iron. The rain had washed away the thin layer of dust that usually covered everything. John walked the perimeter of his land, inspecting for damage, but when he reached the middle of the field, he stopped. The ground there had sunk slightly, forming a shallow depression. He knelt, pressed his palm to the soil. It was cold and smooth, almost slick. Beneath it, something felt hollow. He went back to the house for a shovel, though he knew he shouldn't. He dug carefully, scraping away the wet dirt until he uncovered a small metallic edge. A fragment no larger than a book, bent and dull, like a torn piece of the fuselage. He stared at it, then covered it again. Whatever message the ground was sending, he understood it well enough. Stop. That night, a pickup slowed outside his house, its headlights sweeping across the yard. He stepped out onto the porch, but the vehicle was already moving again, disappearing down the road. The same thing happened the next night, and the next. Always the same time, always the same rhythm. Approach, pause, leave. It was not a threat exactly, it was a reminder. Eventually, he stopped going out to look. He simply waited for the sound each evening, the low hum of the engine passing through the dark. It became part of the routine, like the windmill creaking in the distance, or the coyotes calling from the woods. The noise didn't frighten him anymore. It comforted him in a way. Proof that someone still cared enough to watch. The seasons turned. Winter came, and with it a brittle calm. The snow covered the fields in a pale shroud, hiding every scar, every mark left by men and machines. When John looked out across the whiteness, it seemed impossible that anything extraordinary had ever been buried there. Yet he could feel it, the weight below, the memory pressed between layers of frozen earth. He tried once more to find evidence, to anchor what he knew to something the world would acknowledge. He wrote letters to newspapers, to aviation historians, to a senator whose name he'd seen on television. He received no replies. One envelope returned unopened, stamped in red, address unknown. Another came back torn, the paper inside blank. He began to think that the truth itself had been erased, not only from the records but from the minds of those who had witnessed it. Even Sam, when John mentioned the plane, only shook his head now. "You've got to let it go," he said quietly. "They'll outlast us, whoever they are. That's what they count on. John didn't argue. He no longer had the strength. The isolation was complete. He went days without speaking to anyone, his voice growing hoarse from disuse. The farmhouse became a hollow shell, filled with the faint echo of its own emptiness. Sometimes in the silence, he would whisper to the air, half hoping the land might answer. On a clear night in early spring, he stepped outside and walked to the edge of the field. The sky above was sharp with stars, each one a small reflection of something distant and unreachable. He stood for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the wind through the stalks. Then somewhere beneath that sound, he heard it again. A low vibration, steady and deep, rising from the ground itself. It wasn't mechanical, it was alive, like the faint pulse of something vast and buried. He sank to his knees, pressing both hands into the soil. It trembled beneath his palms, or perhaps it was only his imagination. He whispered, "I didn't mean to find you," as though speaking to the earth, to the machine, to the memory itself. The wind carried his words away, scattering them across the empty field. When he rose, the vibration had stopped. The night was silent once more. He looked up at the stars, at the infinite dark between them, and felt the weight of his own smallness. The truth was still there, buried, but it no longer belonged to him or to anyone. It had sunk too deep into the layers of time and silence. He walked back to the house slowly, his boots crunching over the frost. On the porch, he paused, looking back one last time. The field lay quiet, the moonlight silvering its surface. It looked peaceful again, almost beautiful. But John knew that peace was an illusion, the calm of something hidden too well to ever be found again. Inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window. His reflection looked older than he remembered, his eyes dull and tired. The radio sat silent on the counter. For a moment, he thought about turning it on again, searching for that faint whisper of numbers, but he didn't. Some silences, he had learned, are better left undisturbed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of turned soil and the faintest echo of machinery far away. He closed his eyes, listening. Somewhere beneath the ground, the past still slept, sealed away by hands he would never know. The world had moved on, pretending none of it had ever happened. But the earth, John was certain of this, remembered everything. It always did. Spring arrived with reluctant warmth, the kind that hesitates before taking hold. The snow retreated slowly from the edges of the fields, revealing dark streaks of thawing soil beneath. The ground was heavy with moisture, and each morning the air smelled of mud and renewal. Yet to John Mason, the change in season brought no comfort. The land was awake again, yes, but it felt different now, older, unsettled, as though something beneath it still shifted in its sleep. The corn would be planted soon, the same as every year, but the field no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a secret, and he was its unwilling keeper. The memory of the last months clung to him like damp air. The letters, the tire tracks, the hollow spot in the soil, all of it had faded, but never vanished completely. The men in suits had not returned, yet their absence carried its own kind of presence. Silence could be loud when it was deliberate, and this one was deafening. No one spoke of the buried aircraft anymore. The few who once had now pretended it had never existed. The town returned to its normal rhythm, and John's name slipped out of conversation like water draining through cracks. For the rest of the world, the mystery was over. For him, it had only changed shape. In late April, Sam stopped by the farm after nearly a month of distance. He looked older, his shoulders slouched with the weight of something unspoken. They shared coffee on the porch, the kind of silence that once might have been comfortable, but now felt fragile. Sam told him he was thinking of heading south to stay with his daughter for a while. He didn't say why, but John could hear it in his voice, fear mixed with exhaustion. Before leaving, Sam said quietly, "Some stories don't want an ending, John. You can live with that, or you can let it eat you. But it's one or the other." Then he drove away, leaving behind a swirl of dust that settled like fine ash across the porch steps. That night, John lay awake long after the lights were out. The wind pressed softly against the windows, carrying the faint smell of damp soil and distant rain. He thought of what Sam had said, stories that didn't want endings, and wondered whether this one had ever been his to tell. He had only stumbled into it, after all, a man with a shovel and too much curiosity. He hadn't asked for meaning, only distraction. But the ground had given him more than he'd bargained for, a glimpse into a world that hid its truths not through mystery, but through silence. When dawn came, he went out to the field. The soil was firm beneath his boots, streaked with thin veins of frost that melted as the sun climbed. The patch where the plane had been buried looked unremarkable now, just another stretch of earth waiting to be planted. Yet when he knelt and pressed his hand against it, he felt that faint tremor again, a memory rather than a sound. It lasted only a moment, then vanished. Maybe it had been the beating of his own pulse through the ground, or maybe the field was reminding him, one last time, that it was still watching. He planted late that year. The first week of May brought rain, then a sudden heat wave that dried the soil too quickly. The work was slower, harder, lonelier. Every time he turned the tractor across the central stretch of land, his eyes drifted toward the level patch where the corn grew thinner. It wasn't superstition. He simply couldn't shake the feeling that he was disturbing something each time the plow crossed that spot. The machine's engine changed pitch there, a small dip in power, like resistance from below. But he never stopped. Work was all that remained between him and the hollow that had settled in his chest. The letters stopped coming, but he sometimes found footprints near the road. Not deep ones, not enough to prove anyone had been there, just small impressions in the mud that disappeared when the wind shifted. He pretended not to notice. Pretending had become easier than confronting. The world had already decided that his story didn't exist, and in some strange way, that decision gave him relief. Let them forget. Let the land keep its secret. Summer came early, bright and dry. The fields shimmered under the heat, and the corn rose high. Though the patch in the center remained stunted, its stalks twisted and pale. From a distance it was hardly visible, but John saw it every time. He told himself it was just bad soil, but he knew better. The ground remembers, he thought again and again, and the thought began to sound like prayer or confession. One evening, as the sun sank low, he sat on the bench he had built near the edge of the property, the one facing the open field, and let the stillness of the evening settle around him. The horizon burned orange, fading into violet. The air buzzed faintly with insects. For a moment, it almost felt like the world had forgiven him, but then, in the distance, he saw something that made him straighten. A faint light moved along the far edge of the field, weaving through the corn like a lantern. It wasn't bright enough to be a vehicle. It moved too steadily, too smoothly. He rose, walked halfway toward it, then stopped. The light flickered once, twice, then vanished. He stood in silence for a long time before turning back. Whatever it had been, a reflection, a trick of heat, or something else entirely, it was gone now. Yet he couldn't shake the certainty that it hadn't been random. It was as if the land itself had blinked. The next morning he returned to the same spot and found nothing unusual, only rows of corn glistening with dew. But when he looked closely, he saw that the soil between them had shifted slightly, as if something beneath had expanded and settled again. He crouched down, touched the dirt, and whispered, "You win." The words left his mouth with unexpected calm. He realized, as he said them, that it wasn't surrender, it was release. After that day, he stopped visiting the field so often. He worked around it, focusing on repairs, on fences, on the 1,000 small tasks that made up a farmer's life. He spoke to fewer people, and fewer still spoke to him. The quiet of the house no longer frightened him. It was familiar now, almost companionable. In late July, the county sent a young agricultural inspector to assess the property for drought impact. The man couldn't have been more than 30, cheerful, polite, and utterly unaware of what had happened there. As they walked the perimeter together, he asked John whether he'd had trouble with soil density in the central acres. "It's strange," he said, kneeling to press a sample tube into the ground. "It's denser here than anywhere else, like something compacted it years ago." John said nothing. The inspector smiled, jotting a note in his clipboard. "Nothing to worry about. It's just odd." When he drove away, John stood by the road until the dust settled. feeling the strange mixture of dread and vindication that came from being reminded the secret was still there, even if no one else understood it. That night rain returned. It came suddenly, drenching the fields in sheets of silver. John watched from the porch as lightning flashed over the distant hills. The storm rolled closer, and the thunder followed like slow, heavy footsteps. He thought of the night he had first dug into that soil, how similar the sound had been, the same roar, the same electricity in the air. The memory struck him so vividly that for a moment he could smell the clay again, feel the weight of the shovel, the first glint of metal in the mud. When the storm passed, he went out with a lantern to check for damage. The ground was slick, the air alive with the smell of ozone and wet earth. At the center of the field, where the rain pooled deepest, the soil had sunk again, a shallow basin no more than a few feet wide. He knelt beside it, touched the water. It was cool, reflective, and utterly still. His own face looked back at him, warped slightly by ripples. Behind that reflection, he could almost imagine the faint outline of something metallic beneath a shape he had seen once before and hoped never to see again. He whispered to the water, though he didn't know why. "I understand now." The words felt strange in his mouth, but they were true. He had come to see that not all discoveries demanded understanding. Some simply demanded respect. The earth had its own language, and he had trespassed into it. That was all. In the weeks that followed, the weather softened. The corn ripened. The land seemed calmer, as if the balance had been restored. John still felt the occasional tremor beneath his feet, faint and fleeting, but he no longer feared it. It was part of the rhythm now, a reminder that life and memory shared the same soil. When he sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun fade behind the horizon, he thought less about what had been buried and more about what endured. He knew he would not leave this place. There was nowhere else for him, no other patch of earth that would understand the weight he carried. The farm had been his family's for generations, and if it held a secret now, then that secret would stay with him, just another layer in the long sediment of the land's history. One day someone else might find it again, and maybe they would understand more than he did, or maybe they would learn the same lesson he had, that some truths are not meant to be unearthed. As summer waned and the air grew cooler, he harvested the corn in slow, steady rows. The yield was fair, though the center patch remained sparse. When he reached it, he shut off the tractor, climbed down, and stood in silence. The sun hung low behind him, throwing his shadow long across the field. The ground beneath his boots was firm, unyielding, but alive. He could feel the hum through it, faint but constant, like a slow heartbeat. He stayed there until the light faded completely, until the stars began to appear one by one. Then he turned back toward the house. The night was cool and quiet, and as he walked, he realized he felt no fear anymore. Only a deep, solemn connection to the land, to its history, to everything that had been buried and forgotten. The truth was not his to tell, but neither was it gone. It was simply part of the earth now, the same as him. When he reached the porch, he paused, looking once more toward the horizon. The field stretched before him, endless and calm, its surface glimmering faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere beneath it, deep and patient, the remains of that hidden machine rested once more. Surrounded by the weight of time and silence, John took off his hat, held it to his chest, and let the night wind wash over him. For the first time since the day he dug into the ground, he felt something close to peace. Not the kind that forgets, but the kind that accepts. The world would keep turning, the seasons would keep changing, and the land would keep its secrets. And when his own time came, he thought, perhaps the earth would take him too quietly without fuss, folding him into its layers beside all the other things that had been lost and remembered. He stepped inside, closed the door, and turned off the lights. The house sank into darkness, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of memory of soil, of the steady pulse of life continuing unseen. Outside, the wind moved through the corn like a whisper, a sound that could have been the language of the earth itself, telling him what he had always known but had only now begun to understand. Nothing buried ever truly disappears. It simply waits. Don't forget to subscribe for more shocking real-life stories and share this video so others can see what really happened. Watch the next episode. It's even more unbelievable.